Imagine a world where the chairman of the Federal Reserve is a fugitive wanted for first-degree murder. Imagine a world where the entire economy is bet on a swamp that nobody has ever seen. This sounds like fiction, but it is the true story of how modern banking was born. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. We often assume that financial crises are accidents. We think they happen because of complex mathematical errors or unpredictable market forces. But sometimes a financial crisis is the result of one man and his singular ambition. In the early 18th century, the Kingdom of France was the most powerful nation in Europe, but it was rotting from the inside. And into this decay stepped a man named John Law. He was a genius, he was a gambler, and he was a killer on the run. To understand how a murderer ended up controlling the French economy, we have to start with the death of a king. In 1715, Louis XIV died. He was known as the Sun King, and he had built the magnificent Palace of Versailles. He had fought endless wars to prove the glory of France. But glory is expensive. When he died, he left behind a country that was completely bankrupt. The national debt was 3 billion livres. To put that in perspective, the annual revenue of the government was only 145 million. France was not just broke, it was insolvent. The gold and silver coins had all flowed out of the country to pay for the wars. Trade had stopped. The peasants were starving. The merchants were closing their shops. The new ruler was the Duke of Orleans, who was acting as regent for the child king Louis XV. The regent was a desperate man. He looked at the books and he saw that there was no way out. He considered declaring national bankruptcy, which would mean admitting that the King of France could not pay his debts. This would have been a national humiliation. And then John Law walked into the room. John Law was Scottish by birth, and he was a man who lived in the shadows. Years earlier in London, he had been involved in a duel over a woman. He had killed a man named Beau Wilson in Bloomsbury Square. He was arrested, tried for murder, and sentenced to death. But he managed to escape from prison. He fled to the continent and spent years traveling through Amsterdam, Venice, and Genoa. During his exile, John Law did two things. He gambled and he studied money. He was a mathematical prodigy. He could calculate odds faster than anyone else at the card table. He made a fortune playing faro and dice. But while he was counting cards, he was also watching how the Dutch and the Italians handled money. He realized something that nobody else in Europe understood. He realized that money was not gold. Money was just a means of exchange. It was a tool to move goods and services. He looked at France and he saw a country that had plenty of land, plenty of workers, and plenty of goods. The only thing missing was the cash to trade them. The economy was like an engine with no oil. It had seized up. Law approached the regent with a radical proposal. He said that he could save France without raising taxes. He proposed to replace the heavy, scarce gold coins with paper money. He argued that paper money based on the credit of the land would unleash the economy. The regent had nothing to lose. In 1716, he allowed John Law to open a private bank called the Banque Générale. It was the first central bank in French history. Law was careful at first. He issued paper notes that were backed by gold and silver held in the bank's vault. He promised that anyone could exchange the paper for coin at any time. It worked like magic. The French people were tired of carrying around heavy bags of metal or dealing with coins that were constantly being debased by the government. The paper notes were convenient. They were stable. Merchants started to prefer them over gold. Trade began to flow again. The wheels of the economy started to turn. John Law was hailed as a wizard, but Law was not satisfied with just running a bank. He wanted to revitalize the entire French Empire. He looked across the Atlantic Ocean to the French territory of Louisiana. Today we know Louisiana as a state, but back then it was a massive territory stretching from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up the Mississippi River to Canada. It was a vast wilderness. Law convinced the regent to give him the trade monopoly for this territory. He created a new company called the Company of the West, which everyone soon called the Mississippi Company. The plan was simple. The company would extract the riches of Louisiana and ship them back to France. The profits would pay off the national debt. There was only one problem. Louisiana was not a paradise. It was a swamp. It was full of alligators, mosquitoes, and hostile terrain. There were no cities. There was no infrastructure. And most importantly, there was no gold. But John Law was a gambler, and he knew how to bluff. He launched one of the greatest marketing campaigns in human history. He hired illustrators to draw pictures of Louisiana. They drew mountains of emeralds and gold. They drew friendly natives offering chunks of precious metal to French settlers. They described a land where the soil was so fertile that you could drop a seed and harvest a crop in weeks. It was a complete fabrication. But the French people wanted to believe. They had been suffering for decades, and now this Scottish genius was offering them a ticket to unlimited wealth. In 1719, the mania began. Law offered shares of the Mississippi Company to the public. The price started at 500 livres. They sold out immediately. The demand was so high that Law issued more shares. The price rose to 1,000, then 2,000. The center of this madness was a narrow street in Paris called the Rue Quincampoix. This was where the stock market operated. It was a chaotic scene. Thousands of people packed into the street every day. Dukes and duchesses rubbed shoulders with chimney sweeps and maids. Everyone was buying Mississippi stock. The price kept climbing. It hit 5,000 livres. The hysteria was so intense that people would rent out their humps. There was a story of a hunchback man who made a fortune just by standing in the street and letting traders use his back as a desk to sign contracts. People were becoming unimaginably rich overnight. Servants who had invested their life savings suddenly had enough money to buy the castles of their masters. It was during this time that the word millionaire was invented. Before the Mississippi bubble, there was no word to describe someone with that much money because nobody had that much money. John Law was now the most powerful man in Europe. The regent made him the Controller General of Finances. The fugitive murderer was now the King of France in all but name. He controlled the bank, he controlled the trade, he controlled the taxes. He merged the bank and the company into one giant entity. And this is where the fatal mistake happened. To keep the stock price rising, Law began to use the bank to print money. If people wanted to buy stock but didn't have cash, the bank would lend them paper money to buy the shares. It was a loop. The bank printed paper. The people took the paper and bought shares. The share price went up. The people felt richer, so they borrowed more paper to buy more shares. The stock price hit 10,000 livres. The company was valued at more than all the gold and silver in the known world. But reality has a way of catching up with fantasy. The wealth of the Mississippi Company was supposed to come from the trade with Louisiana. But there was no trade. The ships coming back from the Mississippi were not full of gold. They were empty, or they carried a few animal pelts. The reports from the settlers were horrific. They were dying of yellow fever and starvation. The smart money started to get nervous. A few wealthy investors decided it was time to cash out. They sold their shares at the top of the market. They took the paper notes they received and went to the bank. They asked to exchange the paper for real gold. One of these investors was the Prince of Conti. He was a powerful royal who was angry with Law. He sent 3 wagons to the bank to carry away his gold. When the public saw wagons of gold leaving the bank, a ripple of fear went through the city. John Law saw the danger. If everyone tried to exchange their paper for gold at the same time, the bank would collapse because he had printed far more paper than there was gold in the vault. He went to the regent, and they made a desperate move. They passed a law that made it illegal to own large amounts of gold. They sent police to search people's homes. They confiscated gold and jewelry. They tried to force people to use paper money by making it a crime to use anything else. This was the turning point. The trust was broken. The French people realized that the paper in their pockets was not wealth. It was a lie. Panic set in. Everyone rushed to the Rue Quincampoix, but this time they weren't buying. They were selling. The stock price began to crash. It fell from 10,000 to 9,000, then 8,000. Law tried to stop the crash. He used the bank to buy shares. He printed more money to prop up the price. This caused hyperinflation. The price of bread skyrocketed. The price of milk doubled and tripled. The paper money, which had been the savior of France, became worthless trash. The scene in Paris turned from a party into a riot. In July of 1720, the crowd at the bank was so large and so aggressive that 15 people were crushed to death in the stampede. They were trying to get to the counter to trade their life savings for a single silver coin. The bodies of the dead were carried through the streets to the gates of the Palais Royal, where the regent lived. The mob demanded justice. They demanded the head of John Law. The man who had been the toast of Paris was now the most hated man in the kingdom. His carriage was attacked with stones. He had to hide in the palace for his own safety. The bubble had burst. The shares of the Mississippi Company fell all the way back down to zero. The paper money was declared void. The millionaires were paupers again. The devastation was total. It wasn't just the rich who lost money. It was the widows, the orphans, and the shopkeepers who had trusted the system. Suicide rates spiked. Businesses collapsed. The French economy was in worse shape than it had been before Law arrived. John Law asked the regent for permission to leave the country. He knew that if he stayed, he would be torn apart by the mob or executed. The regent granted him a passport. Law fled to Brussels under the cover of darkness. He left France just as he had entered it years before. A fugitive. He spent the rest of his life wandering Europe, gambling to survive. He died in Venice in 1729, a poor and forgotten man. He never saw the long-term consequences of his experiment. The collapse of the Mississippi bubble did more than just bankrupt a generation. It destroyed the French people's trust in their government and in the banking system. For the next 80 years, the French were terrified of paper money. While Britain and the Netherlands built modern financial systems that helped them fund wars and industry, France stayed stuck in the past, relying on heavy metal coins. This lack of financial modernization strangled the French economy. The monarchy continued to pile up debt, but they had no way to manage it. They couldn't print money, and they couldn't borrow easily because nobody trusted them. This fiscal paralysis is what eventually led to the crisis of 1789. When King Louis XVI tried to solve the budget crisis, he had to call the Estates General. This set in motion the events that led to the storming of the Bastille and the French Revolution. In a very real way, the guillotine that severed the head of the king was sharpened 70 years earlier by the collapse of John Law's paper money. The story of the Mississippi bubble is a warning. It is a warning about the seduction of easy money. John Law was not evil. He actually believed his theory. He believed that money could be created by the state to improve the lives of the people. And in theory, he was right. Modern central banks do exactly what John Law did. They issue paper money backed by the credit of the government. But John Law forgot human nature. He forgot that greed has no limit. He forgot that politicians will always choose the easy path of printing money over the hard path of fiscal discipline. He showed us that the line between a financial genius and a criminal is often just a matter of timing. If he had stopped the printing press a year earlier, he might be remembered as the savior of France. Instead, he is remembered as the murderer who ran the central bank. We look at our own stock markets today. We look at the valuations of tech companies that have never made a profit. We look at the cryptocurrencies that are backed by nothing but hype. And we think this is new. We think this is modern innovation. But it is just the ghost of John Law walking through the Rue Quincampoix. It is the same psychology, the same greed, and eventually it will have the same ending. The swamp of Louisiana is still there. The mosquitoes are still there. But the gold never was. The wealth was an illusion created by a man who knew that people would rather believe a beautiful lie than face a hard truth. The quiet decay that destroys empires often starts with a promise of infinite riches. And it ends with a piece of paper that is worth less than the ink printed on it. This story of the Mississippi bubble reminds us that value cannot be invented. It must be earned. And when a society forgets that lesson, it is destined to learn it again the hard way. The crowd may change and the technology may change, but the bubble remains the same.